So our panelists are Thomas. I'm sorry, my glasses are with age. My eyesight is completely fading. Thomas Biersteker, the director of the International Government Study Program at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. Daniel Fried, coordinator for sanctions policy at the U.S. State Department. Joelle Jenny, director of security policy and conflict prevention at the European External Action Service. Rolf Nikel, the German ambassador to Poland. Witold Orłowski, the chief economic advisor at PwC. And Zbigniew Włosowicz, the deputy head of the National Security Bureau of the Republic of Poland. Not here. Great. So I'd like to for the panel to do. We'll look in broader terms at economic sanctions as an issue. Do they work? How they should be formulated? And then we'll obviously bring in the most concrete example of what's going on right now is Ukraine, and how that reflects, especially on EU-US partnership, whether how the two are working together, if there's a synchronization, and how effective those policies are. So maybe I could start with just a broad question: do sanctions actually work? Is there because there is this debate that sanctions are sort of a soft response to international problems. Maybe I could just run down the panel and get everybody's view on whether sanctions in fact do work. The microphones are down on the tables.
Sanctions can work. Not to say that they will work or that they are an automatically successful response, but they can work under certain conditions.
What are the conditions that you need to have in order for sanctions to actually to work?
They should be multilateral. It helps if you have a UN Security Council resolution behind you, but not necessarily. It helps a great deal if you have the US and Europe and the strongest Asian economies, particularly Japan, with you. It helps if you devote the necessary resources, both intelligence and political resources, to implementing your sanctions. For sanctions to work, you need a strong legal basis, and you need a bureaucracy to adapt the sanctions to that legal basis. The United States put together a lot of energy developing a very effective sanctions bureaucracy, which is, a lot of it is located in the US Treasury Department. And finally, for sanctions to work, you have to mean it. Sanctions are not easy to implement and not easy to sustain. And the notion that sanctions only impose costs on the other guy is a bureaucrat's dream, but it's not reality. Sanctions are going to hurt. They're just hopefully going to hurt the other guy a lot more than it will hurt you. But to carry out a sanctions regime, you have to mean it. You have to devote the political resources to making it work. We did so with Iran over years, and it took years, but they famously have worked, meaning they helped move Iran to the negotiating table, and these negotiations are ongoing. And last point, sanctions work really only when they are part of and not a substitute for an overall strategy. The answer is not sanctions. Sanctions are a tool, and they have to be integrated with a strategy. So yeah, they can work. They're not a cost-free cure-all, but they can work.
And Thomas, what's your view on first of all the overall? There's microphones in front of you. The overall use of sanctions, and then the example here was Iran, which has changed behavior. If you look at another example, Belarus, that hasn't been enormously successful. Is there also a difference in the scope of sanctions, that individually targeted sanctions at particular people close to the regime are just less effective than broader sanctions like Iran? I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, let me first just make a comment on your first question about do sanctions work, because one of the points I was going to make had we had an opening plenary is probably going to say this is the wrong question. In fact, we almost need to stop asking this question. It's not whether or not sanctions work, but whether or not on their own, but whether they complement other policy instruments for the achievement of some goal. And in that sense, in your concluding remarks, I agree that it's a matter of, it has to be strategic, and we need to think about sanctions are one tool, but are always employed in conjunction with others. I don't know if it's in the bio, but I'm currently directing what's called the Targeted Sanctions Consortium, which is basically a group of over 50 scholars and policy practitioners from around the world who are doing a systematic, comprehensive analysis of 25 years of UN use of targeted sanctions. And one of the things that we've come up with in our studies has been that sanctions are never, ever imposed in isolation. They're always embedded within some larger bargaining framework. And so that you've got both bilateral negotiations, which we know are underway, were underway yesterday in Paris, perhaps continuing today, as well as ongoing sets of multilateral negotiations under the auspices of the OSCE and the informal arrangements as in the Geneva Accord. In terms of your more specific question, that was my first take on the previous question. I think there's a danger of assuming that targeted sanctions, because they are more limited in their scope, are necessarily less effective. In fact, I think that's one of the misleading tropes about, or understandings about sanctions, the idea that always more is immediately better. Targeted sanctions, in my view, are qualitatively different instruments. It's not an all or nothing measure. It's something that can be calibrated. It can be ratcheted up depending on target response. It can be ratcheted back, and it doesn't necessarily, although it can, it doesn't necessarily have unacceptably high humanitarian consequences. So I think the move to targeted sanctions, which is now the UN has not imposed a comprehensive sanction since 1994. All EU sanctions are targeted sanctions. Almost all US sanctions are targeted sanctions. So let's move away from the old pain-gain formula. Johan Galtung in the 1960s called this the naive theory of sanctions, and we still seem to be repeating that over and over again. So let's start thinking about how this, I think, rather creative instrument can actually be used most effectively.
Joelle, how, on that issue of comprehensive versus targeted sanctions, how do you see that? I mean, do you see them as actually being more effective, that it does function better?
I think there's no question that sanctions policy has evolved enormously as the tool has become much more refined with the experience of applying sanctions, seeing what works, what doesn't, and under what conditions. On the general recognition that sanctions are a tool that, among other objectives, are there to effect policy choices of the leadership, and therefore should not be a tool that affects the population as a whole, because that is counterproductive. So it has to be clear that whenever there's a sanction regime, it is targeted to have an impact on those that are the decision makers. I think another aspect of how the tool has evolved through learning has been the recognition that one has to be mindful of the timelines that sort of define what sanctions can and cannot do. There is a temptation to grab the sanctions tool as a knee-jerk reaction to an immediate event. And this is a fallacy, because sanctions work, but they work over time. They take time to really affect behaviors. It is not to say that sanctions shouldn't be applied quickly in the face of major sort of events, breaches of international law, major violations of human rights, and such likes. But when, in this first stage, what the sanctions can do is signal that that behavior crosses unacceptable red lines. It is a signaling tool that is very powerful in the short term, but that will not affect the behavior in the short term. We have to have also what many have called strategic patience to recognize that the moment you start applying sanctions, you're very often there for the long haul. That has to be part of the assessment of how you use sanctions as part of a much broader strategy and as one of the tools in the toolbox towards achieving the strategic objectives. There are other means that can be just as effective in signaling that are not necessarily to apply economic sanctions. Sort of isolation can be done through economic sanctions, but it can also be done through many other means. And it's really having the full granularity of those choices that has become the way we talk about and conceive of targeted sanctions.
So should there, when the sanctions are formulated, should the policy response be clearly spelled out as part of that, or that a shift in behavior results in an immediate end or a change in sanctions policy? Should that be the sort of upfront approach?
It is, very much so. Whenever in the EU we adopt new sort of council decisions that spell out the new sanctions, they are very explicit about the common foreign security policy objectives that is being pursued through those sanctions.
Thanks. Rolf, on the, how would you assess the success of, again, I mentioned at the beginning the sanctions regime against Iran, and then the one imposed on Belarus. One seems to have led to some changes in behavior. The other one much less so. Is there a difference in the way you see that?
It's working. Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that as a remark to start with, the name of this panel, "The Age of Economic Warfare," sounds a little militaristic. And I mean, what are sanctions? Sanctions are not a military conflict, but they are part of a political process, or they should be in any case, part of a political process. And some of the previous speakers have alluded to that. I think it's very important in any case that we have a very clear strategy to what we want to achieve. Sanctions is a powerful weapon. But it's not a one-size-fits-all weapon. So it's very important that we have a political strategy going with it. And that's when I get to your question. I think with respect to Iran, we had a very clearly spelled out strategy. It's taken time. Dan Fried is very right. It has taken a long time to get to there, but it is a strategy. It's a double-track strategy based on a political dialogue, and at the same time on sanctions, very targeted sanctions that have had their effect. I'm not so sure that we really had a political strategy with respect to Belarus. There are activities, but I'm not so sure that you can call that actually a strategy. And of course, and that's most important here, and it was alluded to by others as well, we need unity. Sanctions are most powerful when it's backed up by as many countries as possible, and when the US and Europe agree on something, that's already a critical mass. But the more we have, the better it is, and the more efficient it'll be at the end of the day. And it should not be, in any case whatsoever, a means given to somebody to divide us. So whatever we do on Ukraine, and we'll get to that later on, everything we do should be done together. Let's not give Vladimir Putin the satisfaction of dividing us. Thank you.
And do you, with the different types of sanctions, how do you assess the politics of it, of selling it to a domestic audience? If you've got sort of very narrow targeted sanctions, is that simply an easier sell politically, that you have fewer local interests who are negatively affected by sanctions like that. So it's easier to push through.
It's hard to say. It depends on the circumstances under which we operate. Obviously, when you have bigger sanctions, you have more interests that are involved. But you can have pretty powerful sanctions, individual sanctions, asset-free sanctions that can be pretty efficient as well. And the reaction of the groups in different countries can be very different. And it doesn't necessarily mean that when you have powerful groups in a country that the government doesn't decide the way the decision should go. Angela Merkel, for example, has made quite clear on a number of occasions that she will go ahead with stronger sanctions if so required. But the question is, if so required, when is the moment? When is the moment to do that? And when do we have a real strategy? I don't think we have it yet.
Thank you.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the broad issue of sanctions. And I know you've done a little bit of specific work on Russia, so maybe we'll come to that once.
Yeah, but maybe I will start with, maybe we'll come back to this later. Let me make a general comment. First of all, I'm an economist, right? I'm not a politician. So let me look at this from the economic point of view. Sanctions are a certain game. It's an element of a game, right? And the game is pretty simple. On the one hand, a misbehaving country has got some benefits from doing what it's doing. Either the benefits are external or internal. It's quite a frequent story that this is because of the internal needs of the internal politics rather than external, that the country misbehaves on the international stage. And the point is to make, so there are certain benefits. The point is to find the level of sanctions and which the cost of the sanction will simply overweight the feeling of the benefits of the. So that's has got a clear implication. You know, the story is not the bigger the sanction, the better. And let me give you quite an extreme example. The siege of Leningrad during the World War II. While the Nazi, on the one hand, blocked totally made people starve and then start to death, right? On the other hand, what they were offering in exchange for the capitulation was something as bad as that. So, in a sense, the people from Leningrad didn't have the exit, right? They were in the blockade, so the toughest possible sanctions possible. But on the other hand, resigning from the cost of resignation, of capitulation, was as big as the cost of suffering. So basically, one can imagine a situation in which the level of sanctions and the benefits perceived by the country are bigger, and there's a war, never-ending war. Now, the intelligence sanction, first of all, should, at which moment the ruling gentleman or not so gentlemen decide to give up at the moment where they are in a sense forced by the population. It's an illusion that we can imagine the sanctions that will target exactly the prime minister, the president, and a group of his advisors. Now, generally, the sanctions will make pain to a certain group of the society. Everybody, a selected group, depending on the selection of the sanction. And the game is here to make the discontents of this part of the society as big as to force the rulers to accept it. Okay? In the case of Russia, for example, this is out of, it's not a deep. If we think that the crucial support for the current regime is coming from the oligarchs, for example, then the sanctions should be targeted to be the most painful for the oligarchs themselves, not for the general population. But that's the first point. The second point is obviously every country has got its weak and strong points. And obviously the intelligence sanctions should be aimed at or targeted at the weakest point of the economy and the social construction of the country, the political system. And from that point of view, if you allow me later, I can make some interesting stories about Russia from the historical point of view. And so well targeted, although in selected groups of people. Well, with a lot of the information, because the point is that if, for example, we don't have anything against a nation, we've got something against only for example, a group of politicians aggressing another country, then we should make it absolutely clear that this is, and we should make all the efforts to convince that this is not the way of punishing the nation. This is the way of creating the situation in which it will stop misbehaving. So, in a sense, the modern sanctions should be as, modern. Those ones that are efficient these days should be very intelligent, very targeted, as small as possible, to overweight simply the benefits the ruling politicians are having from misbehaving. That's it. So it's not easy, but that should be the direction, in my view.
Is that the way that sanctions policy is formulated? That you do try to sit down and work out the weak points of a particular country and target the sanctions at those weak points in order to force a policy change? And how does that work politically in selling the sanctions in the country imposing them?
Well, over the past generation, the United States in particular, I think the West in general has gotten a lot smarter about sanctions. It's easy to do dumb sanctions. We've done some of those ourselves. We've gotten better at it. Sanctions need to be tailored to the particular situation rather than simply applied mechanically from one situation to another. If it worked on country A, it will definitely work on country B. It's just wrong. Shouldn't go there. We have, at least in my government, we've now developed the tools and the expertise to begin to start doing what you're talking about. Figuring out the weak points and figuring out the best way to target them so that the other guy suffers the pain and the disruption is disproportionately, toward the intended target, not so much toward you, and certainly not toward third countries. That's an ongoing process. I can't claim that it's perfect, but we're a lot better at it than we used to be.
And how does that work in a domestic political context in the States, where you have Congress also occasionally setting up restrictions and getting involved in the process? Is that harmful? Does that create more difficulties for you?
Is the work of the Congress harmful? Is Senator McCain in the audience? There is, how can I put this delicately and survive? There is a natural to and fro between the U.S. executive branch and the Congress. Let us say, there have been times when the executive branch and Congress are apocalyptic in their assessment of the other's respective position. That apocalypse does not always turn out to be quite as bad. The world has not, in fact, ended. There are many cases where Congress has stepped in with legislation which is helpful. There have been other cases where the threat of congressional action is tactically useful, and I'd rather have the threat than the reality. There are times when congressional action could be better conceived or refined, and that discussion is ongoing all the time. As a general rule, as someone from the executive branch, it is better for us in our relations with Congress to be out there with a plan an active plan that we can defend, rather than cede the initiative to Congress. But that tension will go on, and it is a healthy tension in our system. I think it can lead to good results as both sides learn and stay in contact.
Joelle, do you see a similar tension on the European side of things between the executive and parliament in the national countries as well, where when it comes to imposing sanctions or coming up with sanction strategies, and is that sort of counterproductive and make it more difficult to formulate sort of a broad sanctions policy?
I think if you look at it from the perspective of the EU, where the sort of dynamic matters most is in terms of the relationship between the EU institutions and the EU member states, and the different perspectives of member states, depending on the situation, will inform the assessment of the choices and of the options. But I think there was a point made about the threat of sanctions that Dan just made in the case of the US Congress that I'd like to pick up upon, because I think that's actually also a very important point when we think about the impact of sanctions and how we escalate sanctions to achieve our policy objectives. And I think it can be easy to overlook the fact that threatening to apply sanctions is often as effective, if not more, than actually starting to implement them. And that is also part of the policy-making process, if you will. When we assess our options to start a new sanctions regime or to escalate measures that are already in place, the simple fact that those discussions are taking place, the simple fact that the costs and opportunities are being debated quite publicly is already part, in many ways, of delivering those effects. And it has a very distinct, if you will, chilling effects on markets. It can have effects on capital flights. It can have effects on a country's ability to borrow, on international markets, even before any measures are applied. Whereas once they are, markets adjust over time. And
so
there
the
is...
looming threat is in a way effective in spooking markets more so than when you've actually got the policy formulated.
It very often is the case. Markets do adjust, and over time there is a risk of, if you will, diminishing returns on restrictive measures and sanctions that have been applied. So that curve over time has to be part of how we look at developing new measures.
Rolf, you wanted to hop in on this one?
Yes. I thought the argument just made by Joelle was a very valid one, and you can demonstrate that very clearly in the Ukraine case or Russia case. The threat of looming sanctions has contributed to a capital flight in the order of $17 billion US. It has contributed to a fall of the stock market in Moscow in the order of 10 to 15%. It has contributed to the ruble devaluation in the order of 10 to 12%. So all this with a threat of looming sanctions. We had to have the first step taken in order to make clear that we are serious about it, so that nobody could tell us, well, you're not serious. But the first step made clear that we are serious, and now this plays out. And if you talk to people in Russia, there's a lot of concern about this, and people are buying things abroad, and so there is really the threat of these sanctions. It is working.
That's what I was going to say. I'm in profound agreement. There is a direct effect of sanctions, and then there is the indirect effect, which is often intended. The sanctions that Europe and the US have imposed so far in the current, in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, had both an immediate direct impact and an intended indirect impact. And we knew it. We had discussed it. This was deliberate, and that has been useful. And I don't want to get ahead of the discussion, but I'm in profound agreement with what Rolf just said.
Thomas, I just want to ask as well that there's
May I add just one sentence to it? Because that's once again coming back to the game theory. There is not the strongest tool in the negotiations, for example, than a credible threat. But the point is, if there is no the weaker and more damaging element than a non-credible threat, or the threat that is not being fulfilled despite of this. That's actually, please believe me, this is, I mean, there is the whole theory behind this telling you treat to do something, you don't do it, and then not only you make any profits, but then your next threat starts to be less and less and less efficient.
Thomas, I also want to ask, because a lot of this sounds very calculating, well thought out, that sort of rational policymakers are working out the dynamics of how the sanctions are going to happen and the policy impact that they should impose. Where does public opinion come into this? Do you have sort of waves of public pressure which can force ineffective or sort of showy sanctions that may not be the best policy response, but they're driven by a need to demonstrate action of some kind?
Well, I think since I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work on what we might call the design of UN targeted sanctions. And that idea behind it already suggests that there's some rational design behind the measures, when in fact the UN Security Council as a body, when it chooses to impose sanctions, it's a very political body. And the actual design of the measures that are produced by the UN Security Council are in fact the product of ongoing bargaining and negotiation, primarily among the P5, but not exclusively among the permanent members of the Council. So we often engage in a very rationalist dialogue in discussing sanctions and try to talk about how these measures, and I think I agree with everyone else who's been emphasizing the importance of being more strategic about them, but realistically, you have to recognize that the process by which they're created is itself sometimes a very, very political one, and the outcome isn't necessarily optimal, but it is in fact rational product of this political contestation. Your question, I think, was more directed toward domestic political implications of their application, and I think this is what is sometimes referred to in the literature as the sanctions paradox. Why are sanctions used so frequently as a policy tool? Well, one of the reasons is because it's an instrument that you can use to show you're doing something beyond just diplomatic protest, and in fact, and it's significant because it's a signal, but it's a signal, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, that has costs on the sender as well as the target, and that's in part what makes the signal fairly credible. But oftentimes they're used simply because it's one of the first things you can do to say you're doing something more than just issuing a protest.
Witold, you talked a bit about hitting the weak points of a country when designing a sanctions regime. To address the Russia issue, you looked at that a little bit. What are the weak points that you see? The areas where policy could actually.
Yeah, everybody knows about the weak points of the Russian economy, but let me tell something like that. I was myself astonished. I made a comparison of Russia in 1900, 1980, and 2013. And basically, independently of what was the regime, the Tsarist regime, the communist regime, the Putin's government, the weaknesses were always the same. The first weakness of Russia is, in all the three moments, was that Russia was trying to finance at the same time the ambitious process of modernization with the imperial policies. And in each of the three moments, it was too much simply because of some internal factors different. I mean, Tsarist Russia, they didn't want to tax really the nobility, and that's why they didn't have the resources. In communist economy, they were avoiding making the population unhappy. In Putin's time, it is avoiding making the oligarchs unhappy and taxing them. But always the bottom line is the same. Russia is lacking the resources necessary to finance. And then the only source of the resources is was and is the exportation of raw materials or basic. It used to be food and wood in the Tsarist Russia, then the energy rather in 1980 and 2013. And the third point is the rest. Because of this, and that's the economists who understand what I say, I will use the word the so-called Dutch disease. I mean, if you leave out of the exporting of raw materials and you spend this on the consumption, the result, I mean, the imperial policy is kind of a spending on consumption, then the result is the Dutch disease, means your currency is too strong and all the other activities but the extraction of raw materials are not competitive globally. So what you do, you defend them by the protectionism. That was done by Witold, that was done by communists, that was done that has been done by Putin. So the three weaknesses, and actually the point is that it's a historical failure of Russia that over 100 years they haven't managed to change the economy to a degree that will allow to eliminate those three major weaknesses. And in two cases, it led to a catastrophe. 1914 or 17, whatever, and 1989. And I'm absolutely sure that Mr. Putin and Kremlin, they know about this. They are right. Actually, they are talking about those weaknesses. So they know, they understand them. The interesting point is, however, and that's somehow coming to the Mr. Kennan's long telegram. Russia always in the history was addressing the problems of those issues in a particular way, searching for a small victorious war. The problem was that the Tsarist government started the war with Japan and was defeated. In 1980, they started the war in Afghanistan and were defeated. Mr. Putin is definitely much more clever and much more technically efficient in making, because he has chosen definitely an enemy. He thinks he must defeat him easily, and I guess that's the point about Ukraine. Still, it means that even a threat, because for example, in 1980, a well-perceived strategy of addressing the weakest point of Russia by Ronald Reagan's administrations led to the catastrophe in Russia, economic catastrophe. And the policy was to block the construction of new pipelines by blocking the technologies simply, not by not allowing Russia to do it, but blocking the technology necessary. Plus kind of forcing Russia to spend more of the limited financial resources on the arms race and so on and so on. That was an example of an extremely useful, extremely efficient policy. I guess this time it is probably enough to make a credible threat, but a credible threat, of maybe not blocking, but at least reducing Russia's ability to export the raw materials, and that would immediately, that must create an answer from the Russian side, because that's directly inflicting the oligarchs, so the most important group in the Russian politics these days, economics and politics, and moreover, this is a credible threat. Okay, Russia now is claiming we can go to China. We see already what's happening. I mean, that's and probably they understand very well in Moscow that in fact what they are doing is escaping from a dangerous West to the mouths of the crocodile, who will kill them and swallow them easily if they decide to use China as a toy against the West. So I guess it is not difficult to find the very weak points of Russia. The point is only to make the threat credible. One must be really credible about not about really implying those things, but about being ready to do it.
Dan, how would you assess the sanctions so far imposed against Russian policymakers, and have you seen them actually shift Russian behavior?
Well, we will know definitively the answer to that at some future point. So I have to be modest rather than engage in bold assertions. So far, the sanctions which the US and Europe have imposed have been roughly similar, not identical, but pretty close. We believe they had a direct impact, but their indirect impact, their intended indirect impact was stronger. There is massive evidence that it caused both measurable problems for Russian markets, but also considerable dissatisfaction within the Russian business elite, because they may have thought that the US and Europe were incapable of even doing together what we've already done together. That was a miscalculation on their part, if that was the Russian calculation. As I said, the evidence is strong that the Russian business elite is concerned. The purpose of sanctions is to change behavior, as several of my colleagues have said. We believe that the sanctions imposed so far and the prospect of further sanctions are changing the cost-benefit calculation that the Russian authorities see as they plan their next moves. But we are certainly not standing pat, and this has been a major week, actually, for planning among the leaders, the G7, for further steps. Read the G7 statements and read the press conference of various leaders. They've actually laid out a lot of the thinking pretty clearly and quite consistently. In my career, I've gone through some transatlantic train wrecks and crack-ups. Let's not do that again. In this, I'm living through a period of deep cooperation, both in principle, but also happily on the details. This week, both President Obama, some of the other leaders, I believe Prime Minister Cameron, and I believe the German Chancellor, have all referred to the work going on between the United States and Europe on sanctions. And as someone doing that work, I read those and was happy to know that there's a lot of reality, there is a lot of meat and activity behind that. Those were words well-founded in a deep reality of preparation. That preparation is ongoing in an active way, not a theoretical way. Look, when people like me talk publicly about preparation, there are often two kinds. There's preparing, saying that you're preparing, and then there's really preparing, and this is really preparing. I'm confident that at the rate of common work, what the G7 said, I think yesterday, about readiness to intensify targeted sanctions and to implement significant additional restrictive measures to impose further costs on Russia, if necessary, that tasking can be fulfilled. I am confident of that, and that's a very good thing.
Thomas, do you see, because you could also make the argument that these sanctions have been imposed, but Russia still controls Crimea. There's not the slightest sign that Russia is planning to leave Crimea at any point, and that the level of pain that could be imposed on Russia it's difficult to calculate a level of pain that would make them leave Crimea. That yes, they've withdrawn their armies back from the border, but they have hundreds, if not thousands, of well-armed Russian citizens fighting in eastern Ukraine. That the sanctions are not actually shifting Russian behavior in a way that's fast enough to save Ukraine from the potential collapse. I mean, that these are sort of long-term, more calibrated steps, but that the Russians are still doing what they're doing.
You've packed quite a lot into that question. Let me just start with first an analytical distinction I think that's important to make, and that is that we still are caught in the trap of thinking about sanctions solely in terms of their ability to change a target's behavior. And I agree that yes, of course, that's always almost always, actually it's not always, but often is a principal purpose of sanctions. There are some conditions under which it's not realistic to expect a target under any circumstances to be coerced into changing their behavior. And then the strategy switches to what I think is the second purpose of sanctions, which is to constrain. To constrain a target, to make it more costly, to force a change in strategy, to make it more difficult for the target to carry on some kind of proscribed activity. And then there's the third purpose of sanctions, and I think all sanctions do this, and that is to send a signal, as I said earlier, a signal, not just words, but a signal that says we're willing to impose costs on ourselves in addition to the target. That's how strongly we feel about that. I think that goes to the point about credibility in the signals made earlier. Ultimately, so I think, and particularly now with your question about Crimea, no, I don't think so. I don't think sanctions are going to, it's not a normative position of mine, it's just my reading of the situation. I think these sanctions that we have currently are signaling sanctions, and they're significant signaling sanctions because they're embodied with what I would call constructive ambiguity. That is, there's uncertainty about the next moves, and we've already heard about the importance of threats. In fact, it's nice to hear policy practitioners endorsing what is a standard argument within the scholarly literature, that in fact threats of sanctions are indeed more important typically in coercing a change in behavior, in that particular law, than the actual imposition, because that's actually the failure of a certain game that's being played. Listen, I won't go into that argument. But I think we need to think about the multiple purposes of sanctions and then evaluate their effectiveness as a policy tool in each of these different categories somewhat separately. Now, they're of course interrelated and it's complicated, but that's at least my initial take on some parts of the question.
Well, in terms of costs, I guess we'll see if France actually ends up sending the Mistral assault ships to Russia or not, and it's certainly they're at the moment unwilling to bear the cost of doing that. I'd like to go ahead.
Just on that point. I mean, I think there was some discussion last month. I know I did an interview with Joelle on this question about third stage sanctions and what third stage sanctions would be, and the initial discussion was all about petroleum and financial sector sanctions. And that struck me as now I'm not a policy practitioner, and I have one on each side of me, so that struck me as, yes, good to articulate that's under consideration, but that's clearly not the next move. There should be some range for nuance for other types of things before you actually use that precise instrument. So it goes to the, I'm sure it's on many people's minds, a question about, well, are the sanctions too timid? Are they too weak? Have they not gone far enough? I think there's a question that has to be asked again. I have to go back to the point about calibration, about how strategically they're being thought about, and how one can play this ambiguity as much as possible and then ratchet it up effectively for a set of policy.
We've got 10 minutes left, and I'd like to open the floor to questions if anybody has a question. Go ahead.
The speech given by President, the speech, is this working? The speech given this morning by President Ilves outlined a series of international treaties over the years that Russia has violated. Do none of those treaties imply sanctions or specifically lay out arbitration or other means of redress should any of the signatories violate clearly the provisions of those treaties? And could those not be addressed? PR is very much part of Russia's strategy. Anyone who watches Russia 24, Russia Today, knows that. A little PR going the other direction, defining Russia as legal lawbreakers of a series of international treaties, might have its value.
Anybody care to take that?
I'm at a disadvantage because I missed President Ilves' speech. In my experience, President Ilves' speeches are well worth listening to. And I will read it. I will now read it attentively. It is true that in addition to this panel is about sanctions, so we've been talking about it. But sanctions work when they are embedded in a larger policy. And in that larger policy, delegitimizing Russian actions, pointing out the illegal nature of Russia's revisionist course is an important element. And if President Ilves had advice for the transatlantic community, I want to take that very seriously.
I think about the point about making clear that there has been a violation of international law is extremely important. That has been stated quite clearly, among others, by the Venice Commission that assessed that the annexation of Crimea is in complete breach of international law. But I think most forcefully by the UN General Assembly resolution overwhelmingly voted saying that the annexation it was in breach of international law. So I think there have been such measures that have already been applied and that send a very clear message.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Sławomir Dębski, Foreign Affairs Analyst. There is yet another aspect of sanctions we should, I think, mention. I mean, it helps to harmonize our policy towards Russia and towards Ukraine. Without sanctions, probably we would have much more trouble to elaborate effective assistance for Ukrainians. But my question is the following. Do you consider sanctions as an instrument of deterrence against Russian possible annexation of Transnistria, for instance? And if so, what role of sanctions targeted to Crimea play a role?
I think you've heard from various members of the panel versions of exactly the same thing. That is, sanctions are intended to play a role in both deterring behavior and changing the calculus, the dynamic in which decisions are made. Now, to do that, you need to be able to threaten sanctions, but you also have to carry them out, because if you just threaten, then you're nowhere, which suggests, logically, that sanctions need to be sufficiently surgical that you can actually implement them. They have to allow room to be reversed, because after all, you don't want to always escalate. You want to reach the point where you can de-escalate. But they also have to leave room for escalation. And that's what the US and Europe are busy doing and planning together. With respect to Crimea, because that's come up several times, I just want to note that both the United States and Europe have given ourselves authority to act in ways particular to Crimea. That is, the various decisions that give us the ability to go after expropriated or misappropriated Ukrainian assets and the expropriators. That is an important authority, and it can unfold over time, but it has, as they say, a great deal of very interesting headroom.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ian Anthony. I'm from SIPRI, which is a research institute in Stockholm in Sweden. I'm also interested in this question of sanctions as an instrument to harmonize actors behind a common purpose, particularly in the context of your relationship with the private sector, which is an extremely important actor in implementing the sanctions. When you talk to the private sector, do you find that they are essentially unwilling to be part of a political process but ready to implement laws, or do you find that they see the sanctions in a way as contributing to a future environment which is positive for them? I'm just curious about the response you get when you talk to the private sector about implementing sanctions. Enthusiasm, reluctance, hostility?
No, just maybe one example. Before I moved to Poland, I had a number of talks with business leaders and other officials. And the clear message from them, and this was really sort of the high-ranking quad here, was telling me, okay, there are some difficulties associated with it, but they would execute whatever the political leadership does. So there is a clear responsibility here, and I think that they know what is in, but they believe that the political leadership will do the right decisions, and sometimes they put more pressure on us, yes, but I think it's at least an example that they accept the priority of politics with respect to economics.
Just briefly on that point, in some research I'd done previously, I'm looking at the counterterrorism financing regime. Obviously, all financial sanctions are entirely dependent on the private sector because those are the institutions that actually freeze the assets and block the transactions. I convened along with the head of the 1267, the UN Al-Qaeda Taliban Sanctions Committee. We convened a meeting between the monitoring team and 40 large financial institutions from around the world to talk about their assessment of the sanctions regime. I would say in general, they wanted to be as helpful and as constructive as possible. And it was a matter of, if anything, they were mostly concerned with the lack of clarity, the lack of precision in terms of identification of targets, and I think on the side, a little bit of more than slight cynicism about how much impact this is actually having. So there was that reservation, but in terms of a willingness to cooperate, I think it was very clear that it was very strong.
We're running out of time, but we'll have just one final question right here.
Well, in a whole list of things which should be done to make the sanctions efficient, I think one thing is missing, and this is the information war. Because after all, what you really want to achieve by sanctions is to change sort of internal dynamics of internal policy, and not to disrupt your own internal situation. And that only can be done if you can sort of pass the message to the society of the country which is under sanctions, what the sanctions are really about, and how much they would be better if they would somehow themselves force their own government to change the course of events, and at the same time to somehow convince the society in your own country that the price they have to pay is worth doing. So how can we sort of meet this need in case we want to put sanctions?
I think we're doing all right with your second task, Janusz. I think opinion in the United States, and I think opinion in Europe, but I'm confident that opinion in the United States understands the challenge. And my own conversation with businesses are pretty similar to Rolf. They understand the need. With respect to Russia, getting messages through the enormous propaganda machine is hard, especially in the short run, but we've also learned that in the long run, you can get messages through, especially when the nationalist euphoria wears off and the long-term consequences of deep international isolation begin to sink in. Policymakers, Bronislaw Goremek used to tell me that policymakers needed to think as historians, to recognize that you think you control things because you write options papers, but history controls things a lot more than you think, and you better be modest in your expectations. But he didn't say that to paralyze. He said that in order that policymakers, and he was a great one, could act in the right context. We need to understand that in the short, we policymakers are often impatient for results in the short run. And we often overestimate what we can achieve in the short run, but we also underestimate what we can achieve in the long run, especially through determination and patience. And I'm thinking on this 25th anniversary of the Dzień Wolności w Polsce, how much was achieved through strategic determination over time. And I am heartened by the fact that you have in the transatlantic community both a strategic understanding of what's at stake in Ukraine and strategic determination. And that gives me a measure of optimism as we plan our next steps.
Great. Joe, would you like to just say one or two quick words, and then we'll close up the panel?
I think it's very much to echo this question again about the timelines and looking at the impact and the actions that are required while holding our nerves and having the strategic patience of recognizing that measures in the short term may have very different impact from those in the long term. And I think if you look at Myanmar or Burma, people for a long time said, and probably rightly so, that the US and EU measures had as a result that we lost leverage over the authorities who became even more isolated. But actually, over the long term, most observers and experts of the country would say that it has played a significant role in the calculus by the authorities at one point to launch into the major transition that they have. And again, I think the biggest challenge we face when we devise sanctions policies and we look back at the experiences is that, of course, we don't have the counterfactuals. So we don't know what would have happened had we used different tools. And that calls, I think, for continuous, very careful monitoring of this impact so that we can tailor the choice of instruments.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. I guess the issue with the long-term imposition of some level of pain on Russia is whether that pain is going to be sufficient to, as Minister Simonyak said this morning, if Russia is in fact returning to a 300-year-old imperial tradition after a 20-year break, if the impetus for an imperial policy is so deep in Russia that the level of pain to change it may be very high. And so we'll see if the West is willing to undertake the steps to, over the very long term, to punish a crucial economic partner and energy partner as well over that period of time. Thank you again to all the panelists, and thank you to the audience.